Copenhagen stood on the eastern coast of Zealand, facing the Øresund Strait between Denmark and Sweden. Its position beside narrow Baltic waters shaped commerce, defense planning, and political calculations across northern Europe. Harbor access connected Copenhagen with Baltic ports and wider trade routes extending across northern European markets. Around 1800, Copenhagen remained Denmark's political center and the kingdom's principal administrative and commercial city. The city still carried physical marks left by the destructive fires of the previous 18th century. Reconstruction after earlier disasters had transformed architectural patterns and influenced civic planning throughout central districts. Fortifications enclosed much of the urban area and restricted outward growth beyond defensive boundaries. Military geography shaped everyday life because expansion outside protected zones remained heavily constrained for residents. The enclosed urban footprint concentrated people, workshops, trade activity, and administration into limited spaces. Population growth increased pressure within districts already limited by long-standing defensive policies and urban barriers. The Danish monarchy directed state affairs through institutions centered inside Copenhagen and surrounding royal districts. King Christian VII formally remained monarch during the opening years of the 19th century. Actual political influence often rested with ministers and Crown Prince Frederik within state administration structures. Government authority operated through centralized institutions that linked provincial regions to the capital administration system. Economic activity depended heavily upon maritime movement and the kingdom's broader commercial networks across surrounding seas. Copenhagen's harbor served merchants, naval interests, warehouses, and customs operations, essential for state revenue collection. Commercial geography gave the city strategic importance beyond its modest territorial scale within northern Europe. During earlier decades, Danish neutrality had strengthened regional trading opportunities and urban prosperity. Conditions changed as wider European conflicts increasingly influenced Danish decisions in maritime security concerns. The Napoleonic era created uncertainty throughout northern Europe and altered long-established political relationships between states. Britain viewed naval control and maritime strategy as central priorities during continental conflict with France. Denmark's fleet therefore acquired significance beyond national interests because larger powers watched northern waters carefully. Copenhagen's naval facilities at Holmen represented important strategic assets within this broader international situation. Geography transformed the city from a regional capital into a point of international military calculation. Social life reflected visible differences among officials, merchants, laborers, craftsmen, and poorer urban residents. Wealth and status influenced housing conditions and shaped patterns of daily movement across urban neighborhoods. Educational and cultural institutions maintained influence inside the city, despite growing political and economic pressures. The University of Copenhagen remained one of Northern Europe's established intellectual institutions during this period. Scholarly activity connected the capital to wider European discussions involving philosophy, science, and administration. Urban governance faced increasing strain from crowding and changing economic circumstances within defensive boundaries. Restricted land availability created practical challenges that later influenced broader debates regarding city development. Pressure accumulated as international events approached Copenhagen through diplomacy, commerce, and military preparation. In April 1801, British naval forces approached Copenhagen during escalating tensions over maritime policy. On the 10th of April 1801, the First Battle of Copenhagen unfolded near the Danish defensive positions. British forces operated under Admiral Hyde Parker, while Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson led the principal assault. Danish and Norwegian vessels defended positions anchored outside the capital's harbor approaches. Combat developed into one of Nelson's most difficult naval engagements, according to later historical assessments. The confrontation reflected how international conflict had reached Copenhagen's immediate geographic environment. Military events near the harbor carried political consequences, extending far beyond immediate battlefield outcomes. Copenhagen's strategic location now exposed the city directly to European power competition and maritime rivalry. The battle represented a major turning point within the city's 19th century historical trajectory. Political leaders increasingly confronted the reality that neutrality offered diminishing protection under changing circumstances. Institutional responses focused on preserving security and protecting state interests amid uncertain international developments. Administrative structures continued functioning despite external pressure and changing strategic calculations. Economic consequences slowly emerged because military could disrupt trade and shipping activity. Commercial interruption carried wider implications because urban prosperity depended heavily upon maritime exchange networks. Developments after 1801 indicated that Copenhagen had entered a more uncertain historical phase. Earlier confidence connected with neutrality increasingly gave way to practical concerns involving security and stability. Political choices now carried larger risks because Denmark occupied a vulnerable position among stronger powers. The city's geography remained unchanged, yet its strategic meaning had shifted considerably by the early 19th century. Copenhagen increasingly functioned as both a national capital and a contested northern European position. That dual role would shape events unfolding across the decades that followed inside the Danish capital. By the early 19th century, structural pressures had begun redirecting Copenhagen toward an uncertain historical midpoint. After 1801, Copenhagen entered a prolonged period of political uncertainty shaped by wider European conflict and maritime pressure. Denmark attempted to preserve strategic independence, while larger powers increasingly controlled the balance across northern waters. Copenhagen's geographic position near Baltic access routes continued influencing military and diplomatic calculations throughout the region. International developments eventually intensified concern over the future role of Denmark's naval strength and alliances. In 1807, British leaders feared that Denmark's fleet could strengthen French influence during the Napoleonic Wars. British forces approached Copenhagen again during August 1807 under a campaign designed to neutralize Danish naval power. The Second Battle of Copenhagen developed into a major military crisis, with direct consequences for urban residents. British bombardment struck parts of Copenhagen during September 1807 and caused extensive destruction across city districts. Civilian areas suffered severe damage as artillery fire reached neighborhoods beyond traditional military positions and fortifications. The bombardment represented a significant institutional vulnerability because urban defenses proved insufficient against modern warfare methods. After the attack, Britain captured much of the Danish fleet and removed critical naval resources from Copenhagen. Loss of the fleet transformed Danish strategic planning and weakened previous assumptions regarding maritime security structures. Political consequences reached beyond military defeat because confidence in established security arrangements declined considerably. Economic pressures increased as warfare and disrupted shipping reduced commercial stability across maritime trading systems. Trade interruption affected merchants, labor activity, and urban economic patterns connected to harbor commerce and transport. State finances experienced growing strain during prolonged conflict conditions affecting broader Danish economic administration. These developments altered Copenhagen's position within Northern Europe and reshaped future political calculations across the kingdom. Institutional adaptation became increasingly necessary as authorities confronted long-term consequences of strategic and economic disruption. Urban society gradually adjusted to changing realities created by warfare, uncertainty, and structural transformation pressures. By the middle decades before 1850, Copenhagen had entered a new phase shaped by earlier historical shocks.